Imagine you are worth more money than most nations will ever accumulate. Your name alone commands the silence of an entire room. Your address, Fifth Avenue, Newport, the Hudson Valley, is not merely a location, it is a declaration of dominance. Now imagine that none of it, not the silk, not the marble, not the chandeliers, belongs to you. Not really. In 1892, a woman named Charlotte Augusta Astor did something that the American aristocracy had never, not once in its carefully constructed history, prepared itself for. She left. Not quietly, not diplomatically, not with the polished, performative grace that the Astor name demanded of its women. She left publicly. She left on the record. And she left first. The Astor family scandals are often reduced to the legend of the 400, that mythologized guest list that defined who was and was not a member of American high society. But behind that list, behind those ballrooms, behind the architecture of respectability that Caroline Astor spent decades constructing, there was another story. A story about a daughter-in-law who was handed an empire, and handed, simultaneously, the terms of her own imprisonment. This is not a story about a bad marriage. It is a story about what happens when the machinery of old money, the Astor family, the Gilded Age's most powerful dynasty, the architects of transactional matrimony, meets the one variable it never factored into its calculations. A woman who decided she was done, and what that decision cost her, what it cost everyone around her. And why, if you look carefully at Silicon Valley prenuptial agreements and the modern influencer wife economy, it is costing women still. To understand Charlotte Augusta Astor, you must first understand the world she married into. And to understand that world, you need to understand one foundational, brutal truth about the Gilded Age. Wealth was never just money. Wealth was architecture. Wealth was behavior. Wealth was a performance so total, so all-consuming, that it left no room at all, for the human beings trapped inside it. The Astor fortune, by the 1890s, conservatively estimated at somewhere between $100 and $200 million, which translates to several billion in today's purchasing power, had been built on three interlocking pillars. First, John Jacob Astor's fur trade, which extracted wealth from the labor of indigenous peoples and marginalized trappers across the continent. Second, Manhattan real estate, which the family accumulated with the cold-blooded patience of a dynasty that understood compound interest better than almost any institution in American history. And third, and this is the pillar historians most often understate, strategic marriage. The Astor family understood what most of us are only beginning to talk about openly today, that marriage in a patriarchal capitalist system is not primarily a romantic institution. It is a financial merger, a legal contract, a mechanism for the intergenerational transfer of concentrated wealth. Every Astor marriage was, to some degree, an act of corporate strategy. Which brings us to Charlotte Augusta Gibbs. Charlotte Augusta Gibbs was, by every measurable standard of Gilded Age society, an excellent match. She came from a respectable family. She was cultivated, well-mannered, and, critically, unlikely to cause trouble. She married John Jacob Astor III in 1853, joining the very apex of American hereditary wealth. She became, officially, Charlotte Augusta Astor, and the machine swallowed her whole. Understand what the Astor social architecture actually demanded of its women. You were to be visible, but only strategically visible. Present at Mrs. Astor's legendary balls, which were held in a ballroom deliberately constructed to hold exactly 400 people. Because Caroline Astor, the matriarch, the Mrs. Astor, John Jacob III's mother, had decided that 400 was the precise number of people in New York worth knowing. You were to be elegant. You were to be silent about anything that mattered. You were to produce heirs. You were to manage household staffs running into the dozens. And you were to do all of this without acknowledgement, without authorship, without individual identity. You were a function of the Astor name, not a person within it. The glamour was real, the diamonds were real, the mansions were real. But the life, the actual, interior, autonomous human life of Charlotte Augusta Astor, that had been contractually negotiated away before she ever wore the name. In 1892, Charlotte Augusta Astor filed for legal separation from her husband, John Jacob Astor III. Let me tell you exactly why that sentence is more radical than it sounds. Divorce in Gilded Age America was not merely frowned upon, it was socially catastrophic, and the catastrophe fell asymmetrically. A man who separated from his wife lost, at most, a degree of social standing. He retained his property, he retained his name, he retained his future. A woman who initiated divorce lost virtually everything. Property rights for married women were only beginning to emerge in American law. New York's Married Women's Property Act had passed in 1848, but its protections remained deeply contested in practice, particularly for women of the upper class, where vast fortunes were structured through trusts and inheritance instruments specifically designed to keep assets out of wives' reach. She would lose her social standing, her access to the circles she'd spent decades navigating, in many cases, custody of her children, and she would carry, permanently, publicly, socially, the brand of a woman who had failed at the one role society had assigned her. And yet, Charlotte did it anyway. The specific details of the Astor separation, the legal filings, the stated grounds, the private communications between lawyers, illuminate something profound about the psychological and structural violence embedded in these marriages. John Jacob Astor III was, by contemporary accounts, a man of formidable coldness. Not a villain in the operatic sense, no dramatic cruelties. Something arguably worse, a systematic, architectural indifference. The kind of neglect that leaves no marks, generates no testimony, produces no evidence, but hollows a human being out from the inside over the course of years and decades. His attentions had turned elsewhere. His mother, the imperious Caroline Astor, that supreme matriarch of matriarchal manipulation, had, as was her lifelong practice, positioned herself as the center of the Astor universe, leaving daughters-in-law to orbit at a careful distance, never quite close enough to matter. Caroline Astor, the Mrs. Astor, is one of the most psychologically fascinating figures of the American Gilded Age, and not in an admirable way. She was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, operating within a system that offered her intelligence exactly one outlet: social domination. Unable to exercise power in business, in law, in politics, she built an empire of taste and exclusion that was, and this is not hyperbole, as ruthlessly enforced as any corporate hierarchy. The 400 was not a party guest list. It was a surveillance mechanism, a means of controlling the behavior of an entire class of people through the threat of social annihilation. And Charlotte Augusta, in filing for separation, had just made herself the primary target of that mechanism. What happened to Charlotte after the separation is, in some ways, more instructive than the separation itself. She did not re-emerge triumphant. She did not walk into a liberated life. She was, as the machinery was designed to ensure, diminished. Quietly, systematically, and with the practiced efficiency of a class that had centuries of experience erasing inconvenient women. Her access to Astor social circles was restricted. Her financial position, despite the family's astronomical wealth, was governed by the terms of agreements written by men, for men, with the specific architectural purpose of ensuring that women could not leave comfortably, could not leave well, could not leave and win. She had called the bluff of the Astor establishment, and the Astor establishment, as establishments have always done, responded not with outrage, but with silence, with exclusion, with the slow, suffocating withdrawal of the only world she had ever been permitted to inhabit. The cruelest irony of the transactional marriage, and Charlotte Augusta Astor's life demonstrates this with almost surgical precision, is that it does not merely constrain women within it. It is specifically designed to make the exit so costly, so devastating, so thoroughly punishing, that the constraint becomes self-perpetuating. You don't need bars on the windows when you've made the outside world uninhabitable. Here is where I need you to sit with something uncomfortable, because everything we have just examined, the transactional marriage as financial instrument, the social surveillance mechanism as control technology, the deliberately cost-prohibitive exit design, the matriarchal enforcement of patriarchal systems, none of it ended in 1892, not even close. In 2024, the wealthiest men in the United States are worth sums that make John Jacob Astor's fortune look almost quaint. And the legal architecture that governs the romantic partnerships of the ultra-wealthy has become, if anything, more sophisticated, more comprehensive, and more precisely engineered to ensure that the exit from a wealthy marriage remains maximally punishing for the woman who initiates it. Modern prenuptial agreements in the upper echelons of American wealth are not written by romantic partners. They are written by teams of lawyers, financial strategists, and forensic accountants, working specifically to ensure that assets accumulated before and during a marriage remain under the husband's effective control. Trusts, LLCs, offshore vehicles, vesting schedules, the financial instruments of the Second Gilded Age are simply the modern equivalent of the Astor inheritance mechanisms Charlotte Augusta could not penetrate. The statistics are not subtle. The top 1% of Americans today control approximately 38% of the nation's total wealth, a figure that economists and historians note bears a striking, troubling resemblance to the concentration levels of the First Gilded Age. The period that produced Charlotte Augusta Astor, the period that produced the 400, the period that perfected the social and legal infrastructure of keeping wealth concentrated, inherited, and insulated from the claims of women who helped build it. And then there is the cultural dimension, which may be the most insidious of all. The trad wife movement, currently one of the most algorithmically amplified aesthetic trends in American online culture, is, at its structural core, a rebranding of the exact domestic ideology that Charlotte Augusta Astor lived inside. The idea that a woman's highest expression of self is domestic excellence, that submission to patriarchal household structures is not constraint but choice, that the gilded cage is gilded enough to constitute freedom. I am not dismissing the individual women who make individual choices. I am pointing out that the architecture, the legal structures, the financial dependencies, the social networks built around the coupled unit rather than the individual woman is virtually unchanged from the 1890s. The corset is now a content strategy. The 400 is now a follower count.
But the exit costs? The exit costs are still catastrophic.
Charlotte Augusta Astor was not a revolutionary. She was not, as far as historical record indicates, motivated by ideology or a desire to challenge a system. She was, in all likelihood, simply a person who had reached the end of what she could endure. And in reaching that end, in filing that paperwork, in putting her name on that legal document, in doing the unthinkable thing, she exposed, with devastating clarity, something that the Astor machine had spent decades trying to make invisible. That the entire architecture of Gilded Age female existence required, for its functioning, the voluntary compliance of the women within it. And when the compliance stopped, when one woman in one filing, in one courthouse, said no, the machine did not collapse. It punished her, because that is what machines do. There is a question that historians of the Gilded Age are uncomfortable sitting with. Not, was this a cruel era? Because that is easy. Yes, obviously, demonstrably. The harder question is this. What does it mean that the women within these systems, Caroline Astor, the matriarchal enforcer, the society columnists who destroyed reputations, the female social arbiters who maintained the 400, were so often the most effective administrators of the machinery that oppressed them? Because here is the thing about the Astor family scandals, about Charlotte Augusta, about every divorce, every social exile, every woman erased from the historical record by the elegant mechanism of old money. The system did not need villains. It needed participants. It needed people who believed, or who needed to believe, that the architecture they were living inside was natural, inevitable, deserved. That the woman who left deserved her punishment. That the ballroom was the pinnacle of human achievement. That the 400 names were the only names that mattered. And it found plenty of them. It always finds plenty of them. Because the most sophisticated systems of control are the ones that make their subjects into their own most devoted enforcers. Charlotte Augusta Astor filed for separation in 1892. She died in 1920, 28 years of life after the document was signed. 28 years that history has largely left blank, because a woman who exits the machine is, by the machine's logic, no longer worth narrating. The history that remains is the history of the Astor name, the Astor balls, the Astor billions, the Astor legacy, not the history of the woman who called its bluff. Which is, perhaps, the most honest thing the historical record has ever accidentally told us about power. It does not just control what happens, it controls what gets remembered. So here is what I want to leave you with. We are living, right now, in what economists and historians have begun calling the Second Gilded Age. Concentrated wealth, dynastic fortunes, the systematic political influence of the ultra-rich over the legal and social architecture that governs the rest of us. And the question I want you to take into the comments, the question I genuinely do not have a clean answer to, is this. If the women who participated in the enforcement of these systems were not villains, but victims of a sophisticated architecture of complicity, then what does that demand of us, right now, as participants in an economic system that operates by the same fundamental logic? Are we the ballroom guests? Are we Caroline Astor? Are we Charlotte Augusta? Or have we actually moved an inch beyond 1892? Tell me what you think below. I read every comment.